Listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because once you hear this, you can never unhear it. There are basements in America that were sealed for a reason, spaces bricked off not to keep things out, but to keep something in, something so dark that entire communities conspired to bury it forever. In Ohio, a young businessman thought he was buying a charming 19th-century farmhouse. He had no idea he was purchasing a tomb. Behind those weathered bricks, sealed for 89 years, lay evidence of crimes so systematic, so calculating, that they would force historians to rewrite the medical history of an entire state. This isn't just another ghost story. This is about power, about how respected institutions can become killing machines, about how communities will sacrifice truth to protect their reputations, about how evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a diploma and speaks with authority. The man who created this chamber of horrors wasn't some backwoods butcher. He was Dr. Amos Fletcher, trained at the University of Pennsylvania, carrying letters of recommendation from Philadelphia's finest physicians. He came to Ohio in 1832 with impeccable credentials and a smile that inspired confidence. He left behind a basement full of corpses and a town willing to cover up mass murder to save face. What you're about to discover will change how you see authority forever. Because the most dangerous predators don't hide in shadows. They hide behind titles, degrees, and the trust of desperate people who believe that credentials equal competence. This is the story of how an entire community became complicit in murder, and how for nearly a century they kept the perfect secret. The year 1832 brought more than just oppressive summer heat to southeastern Ohio. It brought cholera, the blue death that turned healthy adults into corpses within hours. By July, this bacterial killer had crept up the Ohio River from New Orleans, leaving a trail of bodies in cities like Cincinnati and Portsmouth. When it reached Washington County, the small settlement of Marietta found itself gripped by mortal terror. Picture this: fewer than 2,000 souls, most of whom had never seen disease like this. Cholera didn't just kill, it destroyed dignity. Victims suffered explosive diarrhea, violent stomach cramps, and a bluish tinge to the skin that made them look already dead. The public hospital was overwhelmed, understaffed, and essentially a warehouse for the dying. This was the perfect environment for a predator like Dr. Amos Fletcher. He arrived in Marietta that summer with everything a desperate community wanted to believe in: Eastern medical training, professional manner, and promises of treatments unavailable to common folk. He was tall, angular, with penetrating grey eyes and prematurely white hair that made him look distinguished, authoritative. More importantly, he had something the panicked population craved: hope. But here's what nobody knew. Fletcher had been quietly dismissed from Pennsylvania Hospital 6 months earlier. Not for incompetence, but for something far worse: unauthorized experiments on charity patients who died under his care. His departure from Philadelphia had been arranged with sealed letters and hushed conversations. The medical establishment didn't want a scandal, so they simply made Fletcher disappear into the frontier, where credentials mattered more than background checks. He brought his obsessions with him, particularly his radical theories about cholera treatment that involved bleeding patients nearly to death and poisoning them with massive doses of mercury. Fletcher hadn't come to Ohio to heal. He'd come to continue his experiments on people too desperate to ask the right questions. The Hole family had no idea they were about to become accessories to systematic murder. Thomas Hole, a Revolutionary War veteran, had built his farmhouse with local limestone and timber from his own land back in 1798, when Ohio was still the Northwest Territory. By 1832, his son Marcus had inherited the property, 160 acres of fertile farmland 3 miles northeast of Marietta, complete with a large, cool basement perfect for storing grain and preserves. Marcus was a quiet farmer, 32 years old, struggling financially like most agricultural families during those lean years. When Dr. Fletcher approached him in late July with a business proposition, Marcus saw salvation: $50 per month to use his basement as a private isolation hospital for cholera patients whose families could afford specialized care. $50 was more money than the farm generated in 3 months. The arrangement seemed straightforward, even noble. Fletcher would provide the finest medical treatment available west of Philadelphia to affluent patients, while the basement's natural coolness and separation from the main house would create ideal quarantine conditions. Fletcher moved his equipment in during early August, transforming the largest basement room into what he called his treatment chamber. He installed oil lamps throughout the space, brought in wooden tables for instruments and medicines, and converted the original storage rooms into patient quarters. To anyone who visited, it appeared to be a well-equipped, if primitive, medical facility. But here's what Marcus and his wife Sarah didn't understand. They had just provided the perfect cover for a killer who needed isolation, authority, and a steady stream of desperate customers. Fletcher's treatments weren't medicine. They were torture disguised as healing. And every single patient who entered that basement was walking into their grave. The first victim walked into Fletcher's basement chamber on August the 15th, 1832. Her name was Elizabeth Whitman, 22 years old, daughter of Jacob Whitman, a prose, Paris grain merchant who could afford the $25 Fletcher charged for private treatment. Elizabeth had begun showing cholera's telltale signs: stomach cramps, diarrhea, the bluish skin that gave the disease its terrifying nickname. Her father brought her to Fletcher, believing he was purchasing the finest medical care available in Ohio. He had no idea he was paying for his daughter's execution. Fletcher assured Whitman that Elizabeth would receive treatments based on the latest European medical theories, procedures simply unavailable in Marietta's crude public hospital. He insisted on a strict 3-day quarantine period to prevent infection spread, a policy that seemed both medically sound and professionally responsible. What it actually did was ensure no witnesses to what happened next. Elizabeth Whitman died that very night, not from cholera but from Fletcher's cure. His treatment method was based on what he called graduated depletion therapy, a radical theory he'd developed during his final months in Philadelphia before his dismissal. Fletcher believed cholera was caused by corrupted humors in the blood that could only be removed through extreme bloodletting and mercury poisoning. Where a typical physician might draw 8 to 12 ounces of blood from a cholera patient, Fletcher routinely drew 10 times that amount, sometimes up to 2 quarts from a single patient, while simultaneously administering massive doses of calomel, a mercury-based compound that induced violent purging. Fletcher's doses contained enough mercury to poison a healthy person. Elizabeth Whitman died of acute blood loss and mercury poisoning, her young body systematically drained of its ability to fight disease. Fletcher's journal, written in precise handwriting, documented every horrific detail. Patient exhibits typical choleric symptoms upon admission. Commenced graduated depletion at 2:00 p.m. with initial bleeding of 24 ounces. Patient's pulse weakened but complexion improved. What Fletcher described as improvement was actually progressive weakening as Elizabeth's body shut down. When Jacob Whitman returned 3 days later to visit his daughter, Fletcher delivered the news with practiced solemnity. Elizabeth had died peacefully in her sleep after initially responding well to treatment, he explained. The disease had progressed too rapidly for even the most advanced medical intervention. Whitman, consumed by grief but grateful his daughter had died under professional care rather than in the overcrowded chaos of Marietta's public hospital, paid Fletcher an additional $10 for burial expenses and departed none the wiser. This was Fletcher's perfect crime. Desperate customers, a disease with high mortality rates that made deaths unsuspicious, and an isolated location where his activities proceeded without oversight. He had created a killing machine disguised as medical care, and he was just getting started. The second patient arrived August 20th. Thomas Carmichael, a 45-year-old blacksmith from nearby Belpre, whose family had emptied their savings to afford Fletcher's private treatment. Carmichael lasted 4 days under Fletcher's systematic torture before succumbing to the same combination of blood loss and mercury poisoning that had killed Elizabeth. By September, word of Fletcher's private hospital had spread throughout southeastern Ohio. Desperate families, terrified by rising death tolls in public hospitals where patients were lucky to receive any treatment beyond prayer, began arriving at the Holy Farm with their life savings and their dying loved ones. Fletcher's Eastern credentials and professional manner inspired confidence in people who had never encountered a university-trained physician. The basement that had once stored grain and preserves now housed a steady stream of patients who paid premium prices to die under Fletcher's methodical care. Fletcher charged different rates based on families' perceived wealth. $25 for merchants and professionals, $15 for skilled craftsmen, $10 for farmers with modest holdings. He had also begun charging additional fees for specialized treatments and experimental therapies based on what he claimed were the latest European medical advances. Families desperate to save their loved ones often paid these supplemental charges without question, trusting that a university-trained physician knew best how to combat the dreaded cholera. By October 1832, Fletcher had refined his operation into a grotesquely efficient system of legalized murder. He had Marcus install a separate basement entrance, ostensibly to maintain quarantine protocols, but actually to limit witnesses to his activities. New patients were brought through this entrance directly into Fletcher's chamber of horrors, where systematic torture awaited them under the guise of advanced medical care. The Holloway family, initially grateful for Fletcher's steady payments, began noticing disturbing patterns that chilled Sarah Holloway's maternal instincts. Despite Fletcher's assurances that his advanced treatments produced superior results, every single patient brought to their basement eventually died. "It don't seem natural," Sarah confided to her husband one evening in late October as weak moaning drifted up through the floorboards. "All them fancy treatments, all that book learning, and still every soul dies down there. Even old Doc Hartwell in town saves one out of every 3 or 4. Marcus dismissed his wife's concerns with the practical fatalism of a farmer who had watched livestock die despite his best efforts. But what neither Marcus nor Sarah knew was that Fletcher had begun supplementing his income through even more sinister means. After each patient died, Fletcher performed what he called post-mortem examinations to advance his understanding of cholera's effects on the human body. In reality, these were crude dissections during which Fletcher removed organs and tissue samples that he preserved in alcohol and sold to medical schools in Cincinnati and Columbus. The illegal trade in human anatomical specimens was a poorly kept secret in American medical education. Medical schools, desperate for cadavers to train their students, paid handsomely for fresh specimens, few questions asked. Fletcher's cholera victims, already isolated from their families and buried quickly to prevent contagion, provided perfect raw material for this gruesome commerce. His journal entries from this period reveal the cold calculation behind his activities. Patient expires at 3:20 a.m. following completion of depletion cycle. Immediate post-mortem examination yielded excellent specimens. Total value of specimens estimated at $12. Net profit from case, $37 after burial and preservation expenses. The basement began transforming into something that resembled a charnel house disguised as a medical facility. Fletcher installed a large wooden table in one of the smaller rooms where he conducted his examinations, along with an array of surgical instruments and glass jars filled with preserving alcohol. The limestone walls, naturally cool and easy to clean, made perfect storage for his growing collection of anatomical specimens awaiting shipment to medical schools. Fletcher had created the ultimate criminal enterprise, a clientele whose desperation made them willing to pay any price, a disease whose high mortality rate made deaths unsuspicious, an isolated location where activities proceeded without oversight, and a secondary income stream through organ trafficking that doubled his profits from each murder. But Fletcher's carefully constructed enterprise began unraveling in November 1832, when 2 events occurred almost simultaneously that would expose the true nature of his basement hospital. The first was the arrival of Martha Cunningham, 16-year-old daughter of Reverend Isaiah Cunningham, pastor of Marietta's First Presbyterian Church. Martha had contracted cholera while caring for the sick in the church's charity hospital, and Reverend Cunningham, despite his modest preacher's salary, had borrowed heavily to afford Fletcher's private treatment for his only child. Unlike Fletcher's previous patients, Martha arrived at the Holloway basement in the very early stages of cholera, when the disease was most treatable with rest, clear fluids, and basic supportive care. She was young, strong, and otherwise healthy, exactly the type of patient who might survive even Fletcher's brutal treatment regimen long enough for someone to witness what was actually happening in the basement. The second critical event was the unexpected early return of Dr. Benjamin Hartwell from Columbus, where he had been attending a medical conference on cholera treatment. Dr. Hartwell, Marietta's only other trained physician, had been curious about the reportedly excellent results Fletcher was achieving with his private patients. Professional courtesy and genuine medical interest prompted Hartwell to visit the Holloway farm on November the 12th to discuss treatment methods with his colleague. What Dr. Hartwell discovered in the holy basement that cold November morning would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hartwell arrived at the farm around 10 a.m., expecting to find Fletcher conducting rounds or consulting with the Holy family about quarantine procedures. Instead, he found the basement entrance unlocked and descended the stone steps to investigate what he assumed would be a routine professional courtesy call. The sight that greeted him in Fletcher's treatment chamber defied comprehension for a man trained in legitimate medical practice. Martha Cunningham lay unconscious on Fletcher's treatment table, her skin waxy and pale, from massive blood loss. Beside the table sat two large basins filled with blood, and Fletcher was in the process of preparing a syringe filled with what Hartwell recognized as a lethal dose of calomel. In the corner of the room, glass jars containing human organs floated in alcohol like grotesque museum specimens, evidence of Fletcher's side business in anatomical trafficking. "Fletcher," Hartwell called out, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "What in God's name are you doing to this child?" Fletcher spun around, his blood-stained apron and wild expression making him look more like a butcher than a physician. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the unconscious form of Martha Cunningham, the full horror of Fletcher's activities hanging between them like a poison cloud that would contaminate everyone it touched. "Dr. Hartwell," Fletcher said finally, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I wasn't expecting you. Miss Cunningham is responding remarkably well to graduated depletion therapy. I was just preparing to administer the final dose of mercurial purification." Hartwell rushed to Martha's side, checking her pulse and examining her pupils with growing horror. "This girl is dying of blood loss, not cholera," he said. "How much blood have you drawn from her?" Fletcher consulted his journal with clinical detachment that revealed the depth of his psychopathy. 42 ounces over the past 18 hours, with an additional 16 ounces scheduled for this morning's treatment. The humoral balance is nearly achieved. 42 ounces. Hartwell's voice rose in disbelief that would soon turn to rage. "That's nearly 3 quarts. You've bled this child almost to death." What followed was a heated argument that could be heard throughout the farmhouse above, an argument that would seal the fates of everyone involved. Fletcher defended his methods with increasing desperation, citing European medical theories and his own clinical observations with the fee of a true believer who had convinced himself that systematic murder was actually advanced medicine. Hartwell, appalled by what he was witnessing, demanded that Fletcher cease treatment immediately and allow him to examine the other patients in the facility. The argument ended abruptly when Hartwell made a discovery that turned his horror into something approaching madness. Martha Cunningham was Fletcher's only living patient. The other beds in the basement were empty, their occupants having died under Fletcher's care and been buried in the growing cemetery behind the farmhouse. "Where are your other patients?" Hartwell demanded, though he was beginning to understand the terrible truth. Fletcher's response was delivered with chilling matter-of-factness that revealed a man completely disconnected from the reality of his crimes. "Unfortunately, they succumbed to the advanced stages of choleric infection before my treatments could take effect. The disease is particularly virulent this season." Hartwell's medical training told him immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. Even during the worst cholera outbreaks, mortality rates rarely exceeded 60% with proper care. Fletcher claimed to be providing the finest treatment available, yet his mortality rate appeared to be 100%. Every single patient who entered his basement died. This wasn't medicine, it was systematic extermination disguised as healthcare. Dr. Hartwell's discovery created an impossible situation for everyone involved. Hartwell faced a moral and professional obligation to expose Fletcher's deadly practices, but doing so would implicate the Holloway family who had provided the facility and potentially destroy the reputations of the families who had paid for Fletcher's services. In the small, tightly knit community of Washington County, scandal could destroy lives as sure as Eli as disease. The families who had entrusted their loved ones to Fletcher were among Marietta's most prominent citizens, merchants, craftsmen, and landowners whose social standing depended on their reputation for good judgment and moral character. Hartwell immediately began treating Martha Cunningham with fluids and rest, desperately hoping to reverse the damage Fletcher had inflicted on her young body. Meanwhile, he sent urgent word to Reverend Cunningham and several other prominent citizens requesting their immediate presence at the Hole Farm for what he described as a matter of gravest importance regarding Dr. Fletcher's medical practices. The men who gathered in the Hole Farmhouse that afternoon represented the power structure of Marietta society. Reverend Cunningham, Judge William Putnam, Merchant Samuel Fearing, and banker Nathan Gilman. Each had either entrusted family members to Fletcher's care or had recommended Fletcher to friends and neighbors based on his impressive credentials and professional manner. They arrived expecting to discuss some minor medical dispute or perhaps a billing controversy. Hartwell's revelation of Fletcher's activities hit the group like a physical blow that left them reeling. The respected Eastern physician they had welcomed into their community was revealed as a killer who had systematically murdered their loved ones while charging premium prices for the privilege. The basement they were standing above contained evidence of medical fraud, malpractice, and possibly deliberate murder on a scale none of them could have imagined. Fletcher, cornered and facing the collapse of everything he had built, made a desperate attempt to justify his actions that revealed the depth of his delusion. He produced his leather-bound journal and began reading excerpts that documented each patient's treatment, arguing that his methods were based on legitimate medical theory and that the high mortality rate was due to the severity of the cholera outbreak, not his treatment protocols. "Gent, Lehman," Fletcher said, his voice taking on the lecturing tone of a medical school professor addressing students. "I understand your shock at witnessing advanced medical procedures. What appears extreme to untrained eyes is actually the application of the most current European medical science. Every treatment I administered was designed to save life, not take it." Judge Putnam, whose own nephew had died under Fletcher's care just 2 weeks earlier, was having none of Fletcher's academic explanations. "Dr. Fletcher," he said coldly, his judicial authority evident in every word, "are you telling us that bleeding a 16-year-old girl nearly to death is accepted medical practice?" Fletcher replied without hesitation, his conviction absolute. "In cases of severe humoral imbalance, yes, the corruption must be drawn from the body before healing can begin. But Martha Cunningham did not survive. Despite Hartwell's desperate efforts to reverse the damage, she died that evening, her young body too weakened by Fletcher's systematic torture to recover. Her death in the presence of multiple witnesses finally provided the irrefutable proof that Fletcher's methods were not medicine, but murder. The death of Martha Cunningham transformed Fletcher from a respected physician into an obvious killer, but it also created a terrible dilemma for the group of men gathered at the Holloway farmhouse. How could they deal with Fletcher without destroying themselves and their community in the process? A public trial would expose the full scope of Fletcher's activities, revealing that Marietta's leading citizens had been systematically deceived and their loved ones murdered by a charlatan they had embraced and promoted. The scandal would reach far beyond Washington County, potentially destroying the carefully cultivated reputation of Marietta as a civilized, well-governed community property. Values would plummet, businesses would fail, and families would be ruined by association with Fletcher's crimes. Judge Putnam, despite his personal anguish over his nephew's death, recognized the broader implications of Fletcher's exposure with the cold calculation of a man who understood power and its preservation. "If this becomes public," he told the group grimly, "it will destroy not just our reputations, but our entire community. Who will do business with merchants who couldn't recognize a charlatan? Who will trust a judge who recommended a killer to his neighbors?" Reverend Cunningham, grief-stricken over his daughter's death but mindful of his congregation's welfare, found himself agreeing that some form of private justice might be preferable to public exposure. "The families who lost loved ones deserve to know the truth," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of impossible choices, "but they also deserve to live with dignity in this community. A public trial would destroy the innocent, along with the guilty." The decision was made to confront Fletcher privately and demand his immediate departure from Ohio. The evidence of his crimes would be gathered and preserved but not made public unless Fletcher refused to leave voluntarily. It was a compromise that satisfied no one but seemed to offer the best chance of protecting the community from further damage while ensuring Fletcher could never practice medicine again. Fletcher, however, refused to cooperate with their carefully constructed plan for his quiet disappearance. Cornered and desperate, he declared that he would rather face public trial than abandon his medical research and flee like a common criminal. More dangerously, he threatened to expose the complicity of the Holloway family and other community members who had profited from his activities, claiming that any attempt to force his departure would result in scandal for everyone involved. Fletcher had become a loaded weapon pointed at the heart of Marietta's social order. The standoff continued through the night of November 12th, with Fletcher barricaded in the basement while the community leaders debated their impossible options in the farmhouse above. Marcus Holloway, terrified that his family would be destroyed by association with Fletcher's crimes, begged the group to find a solution that would protect innocent people from the consequences of Fletcher's actions. His wife Sarah, clutching their 3 young children, represented everything the men were trying to preserve. Innocent lives that would be destroyed by the revelation of Fletcher's activities. The confrontation reached its climax just before dawn on November 13th, when Fletcher attempted to escape through the basement's exterior entrance, carrying a leather satchel that presumably contained his journal and other incriminating evidence. Judge Putnam and Samuel Fearing, who had been watching the exit, confronted Fletcher in the pre-dawn darkness behind the farmhouse in an encounter that would be debated in whispers for years afterward. Fletcher was found dead at sunrise, his skull crushed by what appeared to be a fall against the stone steps of the basement entrance. Judge Putnam claimed that Fletcher had slipped while trying to flee, striking his head on the limestone blocks with fatal force. Samuel Fearing supported this account, stating that Fletcher's death was clearly accidental, the result of his own panicked attempt to escape justice. Dr. Hartwell, examining Fletcher's body in the growing daylight, found evidence that suggested a more violent end than a simple fall, fracture patterns consistent with repeated blows rather than a single impact. But faced with the choice between exposing what appeared to be vigilante justice and protecting the community from further scandal, Hartwell made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his shortened life. He recorded Fletcher's death as accidental trauma resulting from a fall. Becoming complicit in the cover-up that was about to begin, Fletcher's death solved the immediate problem of what to do with a killer who refused to leave quietly, but it created new and more complex challenges for the community leaders who now had to conceal not just medical fraud and systematic murder, but also what appeared to be vigilante justice. The basement full of evidence, Fletcher's journal, his surgical instruments, the preserved organs floating in alcohol jars, and the makeshift treatment facility had to be dealt with quickly and permanently before anyone else could discover the full scope of the horror that had unfolded beneath the Holloway farmhouse. The decision was made to seal the basement completely, entombing all evidence of Fletcher's activities and creating a permanent monument to the community's darkest secret. Marcus Holloway, desperate to distance his family from the scandal that threatened to destroy them, agreed to brick up the basement entrance and never speak of what had transpired in those stone chambers. The official story, carefully crafted and consistently told by all involved, was elegantly simple. Dr. Fletcher had died in an accidental fall while treating cholera patients in his private hospital. His sudden death had made it necessary to abandon and seal the basement facility to prevent the spread of infection that might linger in the contaminated space. The patients who had died under Fletcher's care were victims of the cholera epidemic, nothing more, tragic casualties of disease, not murder. Reverend Cunningham conducted a simple burial service for Fletcher, attended only by the men who knew the truth about his activities and their own roles in his violent end. Fletcher was interred in the Marietta Cemetery with a modest headstone that identified him simply as Dr. A. Fletcher, 1796 to 1832, taken by accident in service to his patients. A lie carved in stone that would endure for generations. The families who had lost loved ones under Fletcher's care quietly informed that their relatives had died of cholera despite receiving the finest medical treatment available in Ohio. Most accepted this explanation gratefully, preferring to believe that their family members had died under professional care rather than in the chaos and squalor of the public hospital. It was a mercy born of ignorance that the conspirators were determined to preserve. Dr. Hartwell destroyed his own notes about Fletcher's activities and never spoke publicly about what he had discovered in the Hole basement, but the trauma of witnessing Fletcher's crimes and participating in their violent resolution affected him profoundly. The weight of what Hartwell had witnessed and what he had helped conceal began destroying him from within. He started drinking heavily, his medical practice declined, and he died just 3 years later in 1835, taking his knowledge of the truth to his grave at the age of 42. Some whispered that Hartwell had died of a broken heart, crushed by the knowledge of what civilized men were capable of when their interests were threatened. Marcus Holloway used locally quarried limestone to build a wall sealing the basement entrance, carefully constructing it to appear that the space had always been separate from the main foundation. He planted ivy around the exterior entrance and allowed it to grow over the stones, creating the impression that the sealed area had been abandoned for many years, rather than recently bricked up to hide evidence of systematic murder. The Holloway family never spoke of their basement's dark history, even among themselves. The horror of what they had witnessed and enabled was too great to acknowledge, even in private conversation. Marcus destroyed the furniture and equipment that Fletcher had brought to the farm, burning what could be burned and burying the rest in unmarked graves scattered across High. This property like a cancer that had to be cut out and disposed of completely. Within a year, the only physical evidence of Fletcher's activities was the sealed basement itself, hidden behind a wall of limestone and enforced silence. The secret of the Holloway basement passed from Marcus to his son Thomas, and from Thomas to his son Robert, each generation maintaining the sealed basement as they had inherited it, understanding instinctively that opening it would resurrect a family shame too terrible to confront. The limestone wall became so integral to the farmhouse's structure that later generations forgot it had ever been anything else. As decades passed, the cholera epidemic of 1832 became a distant memory, recalled only in church records and cemetery headstones that marked the graves of Fletcher's victims without revealing the true cause of their deaths. The families who had lost loved ones under Fletcher's care passed down stories of relatives who had died during the terrible plague year, remaining grateful for the care they believed their loved ones had received from a dedicated Eastern physician who had given his own life in service to his patients. Dr. Fletcher's reputation, carefully preserved and protected by the cover-up, actually improved with time, burnished by distance and the human tendency to romanticize the dead. Fletcher became remembered as a heroic figure who had brought advanced medical knowledge to the Ohio frontier and died tragically while treating the sick during one of the region's darkest hours. Several Marietta families named sons Amos in his honor, and the town's medical society established a small scholarship in Fletcher's memory to support young men pursuing medical education. The irony was perfect and terrible. A systematic killer being honored as a medical hero, his name spoken with reverence by the very community he had terrorized. The Holly farm prospered over the decades that followed, its dark secret buried beneath productive fields and growing livestock herds that grazed unknowingly over the unmarked graves where Fletcher had disposed of evidence. Marcus lived to age 78, taking his knowledge of Fletcher's crimes to his grave in 1878, 55 years after the terrible events in his basement. Sarah died 10 years later, having never spoken of the terrible months when their home had housed Fletcher's Chamber of Horrors. By 1900, when the original witnesses to Fletcher's activities had all died, the sealed basement had become simply an architectural curiosity, a space that served no purpose but was too expensive to excavate and renovate. The Holloway descendants who inherited the property in the early 20th century occasionally considered opening the space, but were deterred by the cost and inconvenience of major construction work on what appeared to be a storage area of no particular value. The Great Depression forced the sale of the Holloway farm in 1934 to pay accumulated taxes and debts, ending more than a century of family ownership and transferring the property to people with no knowledge of its history. The new owners, immigrants from Eastern Europe who spoke little English and cared nothing for local history, farmed the land efficiently, but took no interest in the farmhouse's architectural peculiarities. They sealed off entire sections of the house to save on heating costs, including the area above the mysterious bricked-up basement, effectively creating a second layer of concealment over Fletcher's tomb. Through the 20th century, the Holloway farmhouse changed hands multiple times as agriculture in southeastern Ohio gave way to suburban development and industrial activity. Each set of owners noted the sealed basement but assumed it was the result of structural problems, water damage, or simply the eccentric construction choices of previous generations. No one thought to investigate what lay behind the limestone wall, too. It had become as permanent and unremarkable as the foundation itself. Now, here's where I need you to understand something crucial about power and how it operates in America. What happened in that Ohio basement wasn't an isolated incident. It was a perfect example of how institutions protect themselves by sacrificing truth. The men who covered up Fletcher's crimes weren't evil in any conventional sense. They were pillars of their community, a judge, a banker, a merchant, a minister. Respected men who made a calculated decision that their reputations mattered more than justice for Fletcher's victims. This is how corruption works in civilized society. Not through dramatic conspiracies, but through quiet agreements among powerful people who understand that certain truths are too dangerous to acknowledge. They convinced themselves they were protecting the community, but what they were really protecting was their own position within the power structure that Fletcher's crimes had exposed as fundamentally corrupt. Think about this. Fletcher was able to operate because he had credentials from the right institutions. The University of Pennsylvania Medical School, letters of recommendation from Philadelphia physicians. These symbols of authority made him instantly trustworthy to people who had never learned to question expertise. The same dynamic operates today. How many times have you trusted someone simply because they had the right degree, the right title, the right institutional backing? How many Dr. Fletchers are operating right now behind the facade of respectability, protected by our instinctive deference to authority? The cover-up in Marietta worked because everyone involved had something to lose from the truth. The families who had paid Fletcher's fees would be exposed as victims of fraud. The community leaders who had endorsed him would be revealed as incompetent. The Holloway family would be destroyed by association, so they all agreed to participate in a lie that protected everyone except Fletcher's victims, who were already dead and couldn't speak for themselves. This is the essential mechanism of institutional corruption. Create a situation where telling the truth hurts everyone in power, while maintaining the lie benefits everyone who matters. The victims become acceptable losses in service to a greater good that is actually just self-preservation disguised as community protection. If you're starting to see the patterns here, if you're beginning to understand how power really operates in America, comment "Truth Buried" below. We're going deeper, and I need to know you're ready for what comes next. The psychological mechanism that allowed Fletcher's crimes to continue for months and their cover-up to persist for nearly a century reveals something fundamental about human nature that those in power understand and exploit ruthlessly. It's called cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort we feel when reality contradicts our beliefs. The families who brought their loved ones to Fletcher experienced this dissonance when every patient died, but they resolved it by trusting Fletcher's authority rather than questioning his methods. The community leaders experienced it when they discovered Fletcher's crimes, but they resolved it by convincing themselves that protecting the community from scandal was more important than exposing the truth. This is how systematic abuse continues in institutions everywhere. People choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, especially when those truths threaten their position, reputation, or worldview. Fletcher understood this psychology perfectly. He didn't just kill his patients, he managed their families' perceptions of their deaths. His confident demeanor, his medical terminology, his expression of appropriate grief all helped families accept that their loved ones had died despite receiving excellent care rather than because of receiving lethal treatment. The cover-up worked for the same reason. It allowed everyone involved to maintain their self-image as good, moral people while participating in a massive deception. Judge Putnam could tell himself he was protecting innocent families from scandal. Reverend Cunningham could convince himself he was preserving his congregation's faith. Marcus Holloway could believe he was safeguarding his children's future. Each man found a way to frame his participation in the cover-up as a noble sacrifice rather than moral cowardice. This is the pattern you need to recognize in your own life. How often do you accept official explanations that don't quite make sense because questioning them would be inconvenient, uncomfortable, or potentially costly? How many times have you resolved cognitive dissonance by trusting authority rather than trusting your own observations and instincts? Fletcher's story isn't just history. It's a blueprint for how predators operate within systems of authority and how those systems protect predators when their exposure would threaten institutional credibility. The same dynamics that allowed Fletcher to murder patients while being celebrated as a heroic physician operate in every major institution in America today. When that young businessman from Columbus purchased the abandoned Holley farmstead several years ago, he had no idea he was buying a crime scene that had been sealed for nearly 9 decades. He intended to renovate the 19th century farmhouse as a weekend retreat, attracted by the property's isolation and historical character. The price was reasonable for a house that needed extensive renovation work, and nothing in the real estate listing hinted at the horror that lay beneath his feet. He hired local contractors to update the electrical and plumbing systems, work that required access to the basement for utility installations. When the contractors encountered the bricked-up section, they initially assumed it was a failed renovation project from decades past. Perhaps a storage area that had been sealed due to water damage or structural problems. Building codes and insurance requirements, however, demanded that they verify the structural integrity of the sealed space before proceeding with major electrical work. On a cold morning in early spring, the new owner and his contractor began carefully removing the limestone blocks that had sealed the basement for 89 years. The mortar had hardened like concrete over the decades, requiring power tools and considerable effort to break through the barrier that Marcus Holloway had erected in November 1832. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came from the smell. A musty, organic odor that suggested decades of stagnant air and possibly biological decay. As more stones were removed, the contractors began to see evidence of the space beyond: wooden furniture, metal objects, and what appeared to be glass containers that caught and refracted their flashlight beams like malevolent eyes staring back at them from the darkness. The breakthrough came suddenly when a section of the wall collapsed inward, revealing a chamber that hadn't seen daylight since the Coolidge administration. The contractor's flashlight beam swept across Fletcher's preserved treatment room, illuminating a scene that seemed to belong in a horror movie rather than a basement renovation project. Wooden tables still held Fletcher's surgical instruments, their metal surfaces darkened by age but still recognizable as tools designed for cutting human flesh. Glass jars lined shelves along the walls, their contents long since deteriorated, but their shapes still suggesting the anatomical specimens Fletcher had preserved for sale to medical schools. Most disturbing of all was Fletcher's leather-bound journal, sitting on a table exactly where he had left it on November 12, 1832, its pages still legible after nearly a century of preservation in the cool, dry air of the sealed basement. The contractor, a practical man who had seen his share of strange discoveries in old houses, recognized immediately that this was far beyond anything in his experience. He backed out of the chamber, called the property owner, and suggested they contact the local police before proceeding further. The police, equally baffled by what appeared to be a perfectly preserved 19th century medical facility sealed in a residential basement, called in the county coroner and eventually the State Historical Society. What they had discovered would force historians to rewrite a chapter of Ohio's medical history that had been carefully erased from the official record. Dr. Margaret Chen, a forensic anthropologist from Ohio State University, was among the first experts to examine the sealed chamber in detail. Her analysis of Fletcher's journal and the physical evidence in the basement revealed the systematic nature of his crimes with scientific precision that the 19th century cover-up couldn't obscure. This wasn't a medical practice, Dr. Chen explained to reporters who gathered as word of the discovery spread. This was a serial killing operation disguised as healthcare. The journal documents treatments that would have been recognized as lethal even by 1832 medical standards. Fletcher wasn't trying to cure these patients, he was experimenting on them until they died. Fletcher's journal contained detailed records of 43 patients treated between August and November 1832. Every single patient had died, most within 24 to 72 hours of admission. The treatment protocols Fletcher documented involved bloodletting in quantities that would cause hypovolemic shock in healthy adults, combined with mercury doses that exceeded toxic levels by factors of 10 or more. More disturbing were Fletcher's notes about his anatomical research, which revealed his systematic harvesting of organs from his victims for sale to medical schools. The journal contained correspondence with buyers in Cincinnati and Columbus, price lists for different specimens, and detailed records of his profits from both patient fees and organ sales. The basement also contained evidence of at least 12 bodies that Fletcher had dissected and disposed of on the Holloway property. Ground-penetrating radar revealed burial sites scattered across the former farmland, each containing human remains that showed evidence of post-mortem surgical intervention consistent with organ harvesting. The historical investigation that followed Dr. Chen's initial analysis uncovered the paper trail of Fletcher's systematic fraud and the community conspiracy to cover up his crimes. Records from the University of Pennsylvania revealed that Fletcher had indeed been dismissed from Pennsylvania Hospital for irregular practices and experimental procedures not sanctioned by the medical board. His departure had been arranged quietly, with sealed letters and agreements that prevented public disclosure of the specific reasons for his dismissal. The university had essentially exported a known dangerous physician to the frontier rather than risk the scandal of publicly exposing his activities. Church records from Marietta provided the names of Fletcher's victims and their families, allowing researchers to trace the genealogical impact of his crimes through multiple generations. Many prominent Ohio families discovered that their ancestors had been murdered by Fletcher, their deaths covered up by community leaders who valued reputation over justice. The psychological impact on these families was profound, learning that beloved ancestors had been not heroic plague victims, but murder victims whose deaths had been concealed for nearly a century. The revelation of the cover-up proved even more disturbing than Fletcher's original crimes. Court records, personal correspondence, and property deeds revealed the systematic conspiracy among Marietta's leadership to conceal Fletcher's activities and protect their own reputations. Judge Putnam's private papers discovered in his descendants' family archives contained detailed plans for managing the scandal and ensuring that no evidence of Fletcher's crimes would ever surface. The conspiracy had been so thorough that it had literally rewritten local history. Newspaper accounts from 1832 described Fletcher as a heroic physician who died serving his patients. Church records praised his dedication to treating the poor and afflicted. The Medical Society scholarship established in his honor had funded dozens of young men's medical education over the decades, creating a living monument to a serial killer disguised as philanthropy. But perhaps most chilling was the discovery that Fletcher's case was not unique. Dr. Chen's research revealed similar incidents throughout the Ohio River Valley during the 1830s cholera epidemic, suggesting a pattern of predatory physicians who exploited disease outbreaks to conduct unauthorized experiments on desperate patients. The combination of medical authority, social desperation, and limited oversight had created perfect conditions for systematic abuse that remained hidden for generations. The Fletcher case became a touchstone for understanding how institutional authority can be weaponized against vulnerable populations and how communities will sacrifice justice to protect their own interests. It revealed the mechanism by which systematic abuse becomes embedded in social structures and protected by the very people who should be preventing it. What makes Fletcher's story so relevant to our current moment is how perfectly it illustrates the relationship between credentialism and corruption in American society. Fletcher wasn't a backwoods quack. He was a product of the most prestigious medical institution in America, carrying letters of recommendation from Philadelphia's finest physicians. His credentials made him instantly trustworthy to people who had been conditioned to defer to institutional authority without question. This is the essential vulnerability that predators exploit. our tendency to trust symbols of legitimacy rather than evaluating actual competence or character. Fletcher understood that a diploma from the University of Pennsylvania was worth more than actual healing ability in Frontier, Ohio. His patients' families paid premium prices not for effective treatment, but for the social status and psychological comfort of being treated by an Eastern-trained physician. The same dynamic operates throughout American society today. We trust financial advisors because they have impressive offices and professional credentials, not because we've evaluated their actual track record. We trust medical specialists because they have the right degrees and hospital affiliations, not because we understand their treatment philosophy or success rates. We trust political leaders because they have the right party affiliation or institutional backing, not because we've examined their actual policies or character. Fletcher's victims died because they trusted credentials over results, authority over evidence, reputation over reality. The families who brought their loved ones to Fletcher were making the same mistake that people make every day when they assume that institutional legitimacy equals personal competence or integrity. The cover-up succeeded because the men involved understood that their institutional positions were more valuable than individual lives or abstract justice. Judge Putnam knew that exposing Fletcher would destroy confidence in the community's leadership structure. Reverend Cunningham understood that the scandal would undermine religious authority in Marietta. The banker and merchant recognized that the revelation would damage the town's commercial prospect, heirs and their own business interests. So they collaborated to protect the system that gave them power, even though that system had enabled Fletcher's crimes in the first place. This is how corruption becomes embedded in institutions, not through dramatic conspiracies, but through the quiet understanding among insiders that protecting the system's credibility matters more than protecting the people it's supposed to serve. The mechanism that allowed Fletcher to operate for months without detection is the same mechanism that allows systematic abuse to continue in institutions today, the compartmentalization of authority that prevents oversight and accountability. Fletcher operated in isolation with no peer review, no supervision, and no external monitoring of his methods or results. His patients' families were kept away during treatment, ostensibly for quarantine purposes, but actually to prevent witnesses to his activities. When patients died, Fletcher controlled the narrative about their deaths, using his medical authority to shape their families' understanding of what had happened. This is the classic pattern of institutional abuse: create isolation, control information, and use authority to shape perception of events. We see this same pattern in residential facilities for the elderly or disabled, where staff have unsupervised access to vulnerable populations and families are kept at a distance under the guise of professional protocols. We see it in educational institutions where teachers or administrators abuse their authority over students, protected by professional discretion and institutional loyalty. We see it in religious organizations where spiritual authority is used to silence victims and protect predators. The common element is always the same: authority figures operating with minimal oversight, controlling access to their victims, and using their institutional position to manage perception of their activities. Fletcher's journal reveals how he thought about his work, not as murder, but as medical research that would advance human knowledge. He had convinced himself that his victims' deaths were necessary sacrifices in service to a greater good. This self-justification is crucial to understanding how systematic abuse operates. Perpetrators rarely see themselves as criminals. They see themselves as necessary agents of important work that requires difficult choices. The administrators who cover up abuse don't see themselves as accessories to crime. They see themselves as protectors of important institutions that serve the greater good. The colleagues who remain silent about concerning behavior don't see themselves as enablers. They see themselves as loyal team members who understand that organizations require discretion and internal handling of problems. This self-serving rationalization allows systematic abuse to continue because everyone involved can maintain their self-image as a good person while participating in or enabling horrific activities. Fletcher could murder patients while seeing himself as a dedicated researcher. Community leaders could cover up his crimes while seeing themselves as protectors of social stability. The transformation of Fletcher from killer to hero in local memory demonstrates how institutional narratives can completely invert reality when those narratives serve power structures' interests. Within a generation of his death, Fletcher had become a celebrated figure whose sacrifice during the cholera epidemic was held up as an example of medical dedication and frontier heroism. This wasn't accidental, it was the natural result of a coordinated effort to control historical memory in service to institutional credibility. The men who covered up Fletcher's crimes had a vested interest in maintaining his reputation, because his reputation was intertwined with their own judgment in endorsing him. If Fletcher was revealed as a charlatan and killer, Judge Putnam would to be exposed as incompetent for recommending him to families. Reverend Cunningham would be shown as foolish for trusting him with his own daughter. The merchant and banker would be revealed as poor judges of character who had damaged their community by promoting a predator. So they didn't just conceal Fletcher's crimes, they actively promoted a counter-narrative that transformed him into exactly the opposite of what he had been. Instead of a systematic killer, he became a heroic healer. Instead of a fraud who exploited desperate families, he became a dedicated physician who sacrificed his life for his patients. Instead of a predator who used medical authority to abuse vulnerable people, he became a model of professional ethics and community service. This inversion of reality wasn't just propaganda, it became embedded in institutional memory through scholarships, commemorations, and family stories passed down through generations. Fletcher's false heroism became part of Marietta's foundational mythology, proof that their community had been blessed with exceptional leadership during times of crisis. The same process operates in every major institution in America today. Universities that systematically exploit students and faculty promote narratives about academic excellence and intellectual freedom. Corporations that destroy communities and environments fund charitable initiatives that celebrate their social responsibility. Government agencies that violate citizens' rights sponsor programs that emphasize their commitment to justice and public service. Religious organizations that harbor predators focus public attention on their charitable works and moral authority. The pattern is always the same. Institutions use their resources and influence to shape public perception in ways that obscure their actual impact and promote narratives that serve their interests. The more systematic and harmful an institution's behavior, the more resources it typically devotes to public relations and narrative management. Understanding Fletcher's story requires recognizing that his crimes weren't aberrant behavior within the medical system of 1832, they were an extreme example of that system's normal characteristics. 19th century medicine was largely unregulated, with no standardized training, no oversight of practice methods, and no systematic tracking of treatment outcomes. Physicians routinely used treatments that were ineffective or actively harmful, justified by theories that had never been scientifically tested. The medical establishment operated on authority and tradition rather than evidence and accountability. Fletcher simply took the existing system's worst tendencies to their logical extreme. Where other physicians used bloodletting and mercury treatment in moderation, Fletcher used them in lethal quantities. Where other physicians exercised some clinical judgment in treatment decisions, Fletcher followed rigid protocols regardless of patient response. Where other physicians had some genuine interest in patient welfare, Fletcher was primarily interested in conducting experiments and generating income. But the fundamental structure that enabled Fletcher's crimes was the same structure that enabled less extreme forms of medical malpractice throughout the profession. Unquestioned authority, lack of oversight, deference to credentials over results, and systematic exclusion of patients and families from treatment decisions. This is why Fletcher's story matters for understanding contemporary institutions. The specific practices have changed, but the underlying power dynamics remain the same. Medical errors are still the third leading cause of death in American hospitals, but the profession's authority structure prevents systematic accountability for those deaths. Pharmaceutical companies still conduct experiments on patients without informed consent, but they do it through clinical trials disguised as treatment options. Mental health professionals still use treatments that lack scientific support, but they justify them through theoretical frameworks that sound authoritative to non-experts. The financial industry still exploits clients through products designed to generate fees rather than returns, but they disguise this exploitation through complex terminology and regulatory capture. Educational institutions still prioritize their own interests over student welfare, but they frame this as academic rigor and character building. Religious organizations still use spiritual authority to control and exploit followers, but they present this as moral guidance and community leadership. In every case, the same dynamics that enabled Fletcher's crimes continue to operate. Authority without accountability, credentialism without competence, institutional loyalty over individual welfare, and systematic exclusion of those most affected by institutional decisions from meaningful participation in those decisions. The most disturbing aspect of Fletcher's story isn't his individual pathology, it's how easily the system adapted to protect itself after his crimes were discovered. The cover-up wasn't a desperate scramble by panicked criminals, it was a methodical, coordinated response by respected community leaders who understood exactly what needed to be done to preserve their positions and reputations. They had a playbook for managing scandal that reveals sophisticated understanding of how power operates in American society. First, they controlled information by limiting the number of people who knew the full truth. Only the inner circle of community leaders was briefed on Fletcher's activities. Everyone else received carefully crafted partial information designed to satisfy curiosity without revealing damaging details. Second, they managed the narrative by creating an alternative explanation for events that satisfied public interest while protecting institutional credibility. Fletcher's death became a tragic accident rather than possible vigilante justice, and his practice became a heroic medical mission rather than systematic murder. Third, they used their authority to legitimize the cover-up by having respected figures like Reverend Cunningham and Judge Putnam endorse the official story. When pillars of the community vouched for the narrative, questioning it became equivalent to questioning their judgment and character. Fourth, they created positive counter-narratives that displaced negative associations with Fletcher's activities. The medical scholarship in his honor redirected attention from his crimes to his supposed contributions, making it socially awkward to criticize him without seeming to oppose medical education. Fifth, they used time as an ally, understanding that public attention would eventually move to other concerns and that the passage of years would make their version of events seem like established historical fact rather than manufactured propaganda. This playbook is still used today by every major institution when scandals threaten their credibility. We see it in corporate responses to environmental disasters, government responses to intelligence failures, university responses to research fraud, religious responses to abuse scandals, and medical responses to treatment failures. The specific tactics may be updated for contemporary media and legal environments, but the underlying strategy remains the same. Control information, manage narratives, leverage authority, create positive counter-stories, and use time to normalize the institutional version of events. What the discovery of Fletcher's basement reveals about contemporary America is how little has actually changed in the fundamental relationship between institutions and the people they claim to serve. We live in a society where institutional credibility consistently trumps individual welfare, where systematic harm is routinely covered up to protect organizational reputation, and where those with authority collaborate to prevent accountability for abuse of power. The same psychological and social dynamics that allowed Fletcher to murder patients while being celebrated as a hero continue to operate throughout American society. We trust credentials over character, authority over evidence, institutional narratives over individual testimony, and professional discretion over transparency and accountability. The techniques used to cover up Fletcher's crimes, information control, narrative management, authority leveraging, and time passage, are now deployed with sophisticated precision by public relations firms, legal departments, and crisis management specialists who have professionalized the art of protecting institutions from the consequences of their actions. But Fletcher's story also reveals the ultimate futility of these cover-up efforts when physical evidence survives institutional narrative control. The sealed basement preserved the truth for nearly a century, waiting for someone with no investment in the community's foundational mythology to break through the limestone barrier and reveal what actually happened in 1832. This is why those in power work so hard to control not just narratives, but also physical evidence, documentation, and access to information that might contradict official stories. Digital communications are monitored and manipulated, public records are classified or redacted, witnesses are silenced through legal agreements or economic pressure, and researchers are denied access to data that might reveal institutional wrongdoing. The battle over information is the battle over reality itself, because whoever controls the information environment controls public understanding of events and institutions. Fletcher's victims remained buried and forgotten for nearly 90 years because the community leaders who covered up his crimes successfully controlled the information environment of their time and place. They couldn't prevent the physical evidence from existing, but they could prevent anyone from looking for it by creating social and psychological barriers to questioning the official narrative. Today's institutional predators use the same strategy, but with tools and resources that Fletcher's enablers could never have imagined. If you're beginning to see how these same patterns operate in every aspect of American society, comment "Truth buried" below. The deeper we go, the clearer it becomes that Fletcher's basement is everywhere. We just haven't broken through the walls yet. The psychological profile of Dr. Amos Fletcher reveals characteristics that are far more common among people in positions of authority than most Americans realize or want to acknowledge. Fletcher wasn't a crazed maniac or obvious psychopath. He was a highly educated, professionally credentialed individual who used his institutional authority to satisfy personal interests while maintaining a facade of public service. This combination of competence, credibility, and concealed predatory behavior represents the most dangerous type of institutional corruption because it operates under cover of legitimacy. Fletcher's journal entries reveal a man who genuinely believed in the importance of his work and his own expertise, even as he systematically murdered patients for personal gain. He wasn't tormented by guilt or uncertainty about his methods. He was confident that his advanced training and scientific approach justified whatever casualties resulted from his research. This self-serving rationalization allowed him to maintain his professional identity and social relationships while engaging in activities that would horrify normal people. The same psychological profile appears throughout American institutions today. Highly credentialed professionals who use their authority to serve personal interests while convincing themselves and others that they're engaged in important work that benefits society. We see this in financial executives who destroy retirement savings while believing they're optimizing market efficiency. We see it in pharmaceutical researchers who suppress negative data about drug safety while believing they're advancing medical science. We see it in intelligence officials who violate constitutional rights while believing they're protecting national security. We see it in academic administrators who exploit students and faculty while believing they're preserving educational excellence. We see it in religious leaders who abuse their authority while believing they're serving God and their communities. The common elements are always the same. Institutional position that provides access to vulnerable populations, professional identity that justifies harmful actions as necessary for greater good, and social environment that rewards institutional loyalty over individual conscience. Fletcher could murder patients because he convinced himself that advancing medical knowledge required accepting casualties from experimental treatments. Contemporary institutional predators engage in systematic harm because they convince themselves that achieving organizational objectives requires accepting collateral damage from necessary policies and procedures. The community leaders who covered up Fletcher's crimes weren't motivated by personal loyalty to him. They barely knew him and had no emotional investment in his welfare. Their motivation was much more calculated and ultimately more disturbing. They understood that Fletcher's exposure would damage the institutional structures that gave them power and status in Marietta society. Judge Putnam's authority depended on public confidence in his judgment and character. If he could be fooled by an obvious charlatan into recommending that charlatan to his neighbors, how could the community trust his judicial decisions? Reverend Cunningham's influence dues. depended on his reputation for moral discernment and spiritual wisdom. If he could be deceived into trusting his daughter's life to a killer, how could his congregation rely on his guidance in matters of faith and ethics? The banker and merchant's success depended on their standing as reliable judges of character and business opportunities. If they could be manipulated into promoting a predator, how could clients trust their financial advice or commercial partnerships? So the cover-up wasn't really about protecting Fletcher. It was about protecting the system of authority relationships that made their community function according to their preferences. They sacrificed justice for Fletcher's victims to preserve confidence in the institutional structures that gave them power, wealth, and social position. This is the essential mechanism of institutional corruption. Those who benefit from existing power structures will collaborate to prevent accountability for systematic harm when that accountability would threaten their own positions. The cover-up becomes more important than the original crime because the cover-up protects the system while exposing the crime would damage the system. We see this dynamic operating in every major institution in America today. Police departments cover up misconduct to protect public confidence in law enforcement authority. Military leaders conceal strategic failures to preserve confidence in national defense capabilities. Corporate executives suppress information about product dangers to maintain confidence in market institutions. University administrators hide research fraud to protect confidence in academic expertise. Religious hierarchies transfer predatory clergy to avoid scandals that would undermine spiritual authority. Government agencies classify evidence of systematic wrongdoing to prevent damage to public confidence in democratic institutions. In every case, institutional self-preservation takes precedence over individual welfare, and those who benefit from institutional authority collaborate to prevent accountability that might threaten their positions. What makes Fletcher's story particularly relevant to our current historical moment is how it demonstrates the relationship between crisis and predatory exploitation of vulnerable populations. The 1832 cholera epidemic created exactly the conditions that predators like Fletcher need to operate. Widespread fear, desperate people willing to pay any price for hope, overwhelmed traditional institutions, and social disruption that creates opportunities for those positioned to exploit chaos. Fletcher didn't create the cholera epidemic, but he positioned himself to profit from it by offering desperate families what they most wanted: hope for survival and the social status of receiving care from a prestigious medical authority. His crimes were possible because the crisis had made people willing to trust anyone who offered them what they needed, regardless of whether that person could actually deliver it. We've seen the same dynamic operating throughout American history during every major crisis. Economic collapses, wars, natural disasters, and social upheavals create opportunities for institutional predators to exploit vulnerable populations under cover of providing necessary services or expertise. The 2008 financial crisis allowed predatory lenders and financial advisors to systematically exploit families losing their homes and retirement savings. The COVID-19 pandemic created opportunities for healthcare profiteers to exploit desperate patients and families through unnecessary treatments, fraudulent therapies, and price gouging for essential services. The current immigration crisis has enabled systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations by both government agencies and private contractors who profit from detention and deportation services. Each crisis follows the same pattern. Existing institutions fail to protect vulnerable populations, creating opportunities for predatory actors to offer services that exploit desperation while appearing to provide help. The predators position themselves as experts or authorities who understand how to navigate the crisis, gaining access to victims who are too desperate to carefully evaluate their credentials or track record. During the exploitation phase, the predators use their authority to control information and manage perception of their activities, preventing oversight or accountability that might interfere with their operations. After the crisis passes, the institutional establishment collaborates to cover up the predatory exploitation because exposing it would reveal the systematic failures that made it possible, threatening confidence in the institutions that are supposed to prevent such exploitation. The discovery of Fletcher's basement in the 21st century forced a reckoning not just with historical facts, but with the psychological and social mechanisms that allow systematic institutional abuse to continue across generations. Dr. Margaret Chen's forensic analysis didn't just reveal Fletcher's crimes, it revealed how those crimes had been systematically erased from historical memory through coordinated narrative management by community leaders who valued institutional credibility over justice for victims. The most disturbing aspect of Dr. Chen's findings wasn't the evidence of Fletcher's murders, but the evidence of how thoroughly the cover-up had succeeded in transforming a serial killer into a local hero. For nearly a century, Fletcher had been remembered as exactly the opposite of what he actually was, demonstrating how completely institutional narratives can invert reality when those narratives serve the interests of people with authority to shape public memory. This revelation forced uncomfortable questions about other aspects of local and national history that might have been similarly manipulated by institutional authorities seeking to protect their reputations and interests. If community leaders in 1832 could so completely rewrite the story of Fletcher's crimes, what other historical narratives might be fabrications designed to serve institutional interests rather than historical truth? Dr. Chen's research team began investigating similar cases throughout the Ohio River Valley, discovering evidence of systematic patterns of medical exploitation during the cholera epidemics of the 1830s that had been covered up by local authorities in multiple communities. The Fletcher case wasn't unique. It was part of a broader pattern of predatory behavior that had been enabled by the combination of medical authority, social desperation, and institutional self-protection that characterized frontier healthcare during disease outbreaks. But the implications extended far beyond historical curiosity. The same mechanisms that had allowed Fletcher to operate and his crimes to be covered up were still operating in contemporary American institutions. The discovery of his basement became a metaphor for all the sealed chambers of institutional memory where evidence of systematic harm lay hidden behind walls of authority, credentialism, and narrative control. The physical act of breaking through the limestone barrier that had concealed Fletcher's chamber became symbolic of the intellectual and psychological work required to break through the barriers of institutional propaganda and discover what actually happens when authority operates without accountability. The media coverage of Fletcher's basement discovery revealed how contemporary institutions respond to revelations that threaten foundational narratives about American society and its institutions. Initial reporting focused on the sensational aspects of the discovery, the preserved 19th-century medical equipment, the gruesome evidence of Fletcher's crimes, the dramatic revelation of community cover-up. But as the story developed, coverage began shifting toward containment strategies designed to limit the implications of Fletcher's story for understanding contemporary institutional behavior. Media outlets emphasized the historical distance of Fletcher's crimes, framing them as examples of primitive 19th-century medical practice rather than systematic institutional predation that continues today. They focused on the community leaders' supposedly understandable desire to protect their town's reputation rather than analyzing the mechanisms of cover-up that operate throughout American society. They presented the discovery as a fascinating historical curiosity rather than a case study in how authority operates to protect itself from accountability for harm to vulnerable populations. This coverage pattern reveals how contemporary media functions as part of the institutional establishment's narrative management system, helping to contain revelations that might threaten public confidence in existing authority structures. By framing Fletcher's story as historical aberration rather than contemporary pattern, media coverage prevented audiences from recognizing the same dynamics in current institutions and events. Academic historians and medical ethicists who studied Fletcher's case were more direct about its contemporary implications, but their analysis was largely confined to professional journals and academic conferences where it would have minimal impact on public understanding. The institutional academic establishment, like the media establishment, has incentives to avoid analysis that might threaten confidence in the credentialing and authority systems that give academic institutions their power and influence in American society. Legal experts who examined the cover-up focused on the question of whether temporary law enforcement and judicial systems would prevent similar crimes and conspiracies, generally concluding that modern oversight and regulation make Fletcher-type cases impossible today. But this analysis ignored the systematic ways that contemporary institutions use legal and regulatory capture to prevent oversight and accountability, essentially legalizing the types of exploitation that Fletcher accomplished through isolation and authority manipulation. The psychological impact of Fletcher's basement discovery on the descendants of his victims and the families of community leaders who participated in the cover-up reveals the intergenerational trauma that results from systematic institutional deception. Families who had celebrated ancestors as heroic plague victims discovered they were actually murder victims whose deaths had been concealed to protect community leaders' reputations. Descendants of the men who orchestrated the cover-up faced the realization that their honored ancestors had sacrificed justice for victims to preserve their own social positions and institutional authority. These revelations destroyed family mythologies that had been maintained for nearly 2 centuries, forcing people to confront the possibility that other foundational beliefs about their families, communities, and institutions might also be fabrications designed to serve powerful interests rather than historical truth. The psychological work required to process these revelations, accepting that trusted authorities had systematically lied, that honored ancestors had been complicit in covering up mass murder, that community institutions had been built on foundations of concealed crime, represents the same psychological work that all Americans must eventually undertake to understand how contemporary institutions actually operate. Dr. Chen's research team found that families' responses to learning the truth about Fletcher followed predictable patterns that illuminate how people cope with revelations that threaten their foundational beliefs about authority and institutions. Some families immediately accepted the evidence and began questioning other official narratives they had previously accepted without examination. Others rejected the evidence entirely, preferring to maintain comfortable beliefs rather than confront uncomfortable truths about their ancestors and community. Still others accepted the historical facts but insisted that contemporary institutions operate differently, allowing them to maintain confidence in current authority structures while acknowledging past failures. These response patterns reflect the broader challenge that Fletcher's story presents to American society. Confronting the evidence requires accepting that the same mechanisms that enabled his crimes and their cover-up continue to operate throughout contemporary institutional structures. The sealed basement becomes a metaphor for all the uncomfortable truths that American institutions keep hidden behind walls of authority, credentialism, and narrative control. Breaking through those walls requires the same kind of systematic effort that was needed to break through the limestone barrier that concealed Fletcher's chamber, sustained work that most people are psychologically unprepared to undertake because the discoveries threaten foundational beliefs about American society and its institutions. The ultimate lesson of Dr. Amos Fletcher's basement isn't about 19th century medical practice or frontier justice. It's about the eternal relationship between power and accountability in human societies. Fletcher's crimes were enabled by the same dynamics that enable institutional predation today: authority without oversight, credentialism without competence, institutional loyalty over individual conscience, and systematic exclusion of victims from meaningful participation in decisions that affect their lives. The cover-up that followed Fletcher's death reveals how institutional establishments protect themselves from accountability by controlling information, managing narratives, leveraging authority, creating positive counterstories, and using time to normalize their version of events. These techniques have been refined and professionalized in contemporary America, but their essential function remains the same: preventing accountability for institutional harm by managing public perception of institutions and their activities. Fletcher's basement remained sealed for 89 years because breaking through the limestone barrier required more effort than most people were willing to invest in questioning established narratives about their community's history. The same dynamic operates throughout American society today. The barriers that conceal institutional wrongdoing remain intact because breaking through them requires more sustained effort than most people are willing to invest in questioning established narratives about their institutions. But Fletcher's story also demonstrates that physical evidence eventually surfaces, that carefully constructed cover-ups eventually fail, and that truth eventually emerges regardless of how much effort institutional authorities invest in concealing it. The limestone wall could preserve Fletcher's chamber for nearly a century, but it couldn't prevent its eventual discovery by someone with no investment in maintaining the community's foundational mythology. This gives us hope that other sealed chambers will eventually be opened, other cover-ups will eventually be exposed, and other victims will eventually receive justice, even if that justice comes decades or centuries after their deaths. The question each of us must answer is whether we'll participate in breaking through the walls that conceal institutional wrongdoing, or whether we'll help maintain those walls because confronting what lies behind them would threaten our comfortable beliefs about authority, credentialism, and institutional legitimacy. Fletcher's base. Ament is everywhere in American society. We just haven't developed the will to break through the barriers that keep it sealed. But every wall can be broken if enough people are willing to invest the effort required to discover what lies behind it. The truth about American institutions is waiting behind limestone barriers of authority and credentialism, preserved like Fletcher's chamber, until someone with courage and tools finally breaks through to reveal what's actually been happening in the sealed spaces where power operates without accountability.